Tough conversations, but hopefully really interesting ones. So really appreciate Brian and Gloria today, and the audience as well. The hope is for us to me to pose some questions to Brian and Gloria for open discussion, to hear their viewpoints on items, and then towards the end there'll be time for crowd interaction, questions, etc., and really maybe some commitments to action. So we'll see how this goes. But to start, I really want to ground us in the experience of Brian and Gloria, that you guys have kind of grown up in the insurance industry. So we've gotten a chance to talk before this panel, and you both described building careers in spaces where you were often one of few or the only Black person in the room. And maybe Brian, you could kind of start by addressing this question, but how was that experience? What was it safe to say out loud in those early years? What did you have to leave at the door?
Yep. Thank you for that. So it's interesting. I wouldn't say the question is what is safe, right? So I think it's safe is like don't drive through sundown towns, but it's understanding the ramifications of what you say and what you do, and how that might affect how you're viewed or how you're treated. Early off, I got out of school, right out of college. I started working at a company down in Atlanta. Again, I was the only one there. I think the only one ever at that company at the time, and at that point, I actually didn't care. I was 22 years old, and I said what I wanted to say and did what I wanted to do. And here's a great story. I remember at some point, the movie Malcolm X came out with Denzel Washington, and I got myself a X hat. I don't see a lot of you younger ones don't remember this, but we had the X hats, and that way everybody wore them around. I remember wearing them to company functions. We'd go out or something, and so that led to a whole bunch of conversation about Malcolm X, right? Oh, what did he do? He didn't do that. He did do this. And what I realized after a while, it's like, wait, it's not my job to educate people about things they haven't educated themselves about. So I started thinking, hey, I could do this or say this that might lead to a conversation that, quite frankly, I didn't want to get into. So going forward, and this is kind of a rule for me. Everything I say and do, I always ask this question: is it going to get me closer to my goal or further from my goal? And so you realize that. And again, a kid coming out of school, you weren't ready for that. Um, you just have to think about, if you say or do certain things, you might be seeing through a certain lens, and either you care or don't care about
Hmm. And I really love that. And that's speaking of the burden of education. And so I think some years ago, after George Floyd and a lot of focus on systemic racism, it felt like it was safe to discuss certain conversations. And really, some of the hope for the content that IABA put forward was equipping folks with a new lens and taking that burden off of the individual to
it.
say, hey, here's what happened. Let's talk about this in a kind of wider landscape. So I'm excited to double click into that down the line. Gloria, I wondered if you wanted to kind of address the question, talk about your background, your entrance into the space, your kind of ascension up the corporate ladder, and even within IBA itself. How was your experience, and anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I came in, I started working maybe like 8 years after I had moved here from Kenya. So I came in with a immigrant like mindset. So coming into work at first, like even speaking up never even crossed my mind. I thought my job was to come in, put my head down, do the work, and get out of here. Make friends if I could, but not necessarily like that was not part of why I was there. I was there to make money, put my head down. However, I come from a household that my father just likes to speak out as much as he can about any and everything. And one of his passions has been like racism in America. So I think some of that rubbed off on me. And he would always constantly tell me, like, if you see something, you have to say something. And I remember the first time I spoke up, it wasn't, I didn't think I was speaking anything that was like different. I was in a group, I was in a big review meeting, and it was managers and above, and it seemed like one of the black analysts was being viewed in my eyes not objectively. And so I said something, and it didn't seem like a fight to me. I was just like, well, I think you should view it this way. And all of a sudden, I started getting pings from people like, oh my God, I'm so happy you spoke up. Like, this is why you're here. And to me, I was just like, what? It's really obvious, right? It's not like I'm not doing anything profound here. I'm just saying things that I thought, honestly, I thought it was akin to me unmuting and saying thank you. But to them, it was like, no, you actually added value. And then from there, I realized just how much people don't speak up on things that could be obvious. And so I was like, you know what? I just need to say, if I see it, I'm going to say something and let the cards fall where they may.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love that. And I think it really speaks to a lot of shared experiences of the comfort in ourselves or in our what we bring to the table, or even that confidence in order to speak up and say things. And I'm really excited to translate that into what that might look like for the IABA as this panel continues. And as you both are now at very different positions than where you started. Before we hop into that, I guess I really want to take a step back to kind of set the landscape for the industry. Right now, there's a few, I guess, a few things going on with this current environment and really what's been building since the last time I was kind of engaged in these conversations back in 2020. One of the interesting developments that came up was the NAIC formed its Race and Insurance Coalition in 2020 that seemed really promising, really great, that they were going to take a real look from a regulator's perspective of systemic racism and responsibility. So are you familiar with the charter of the group and aware of any outcomes of that coalition?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the group. I will admit I haven't followed up on what came out of the group ever since 2020. I do know that it was formed and it was supposed to be not necessarily a permanent committee. So from 2025, I know that it was absorbed into some of the other permanent committees. Um, I think that from like 2020 was just in general such a good time and a year of reckoning, and it created we made so much progress in awareness. So I'm hoping that even though I haven't necessarily followed up, there are things that were done that are that lent to our progress of our movement.
Mm. And Brian, any familiarity with that coalition or outcomes?
Yeah, so I remember they did the study and they haven't updated it, and quite frankly, I haven't heard anything since then. But I think, like all things, it doesn't surprise me. Sometimes there's a lot of focus on, I don't want to say pretending, but there's a lot of focus on showing that you're doing the work, and
Mm.
then after that, they just let it go and say, okay, we did the work now, everything is done. And I think, and we'll talk about this later, it's up to us, to the affected, to say, hey, listen, whatever happened with this thing? Why didn't we do anything with it? To ask questions, and again, we'll talk about this later. To make sure you're on the committees, to make sure you volunteer, for these when they're doing these studies, that you can affect the outcome and make sure it comes to fruition.
And
Awesome.
I'll add,
Oh, go ahead, Gloria.
sorry, I'm gonna add something because sometimes we talk about doing things for the spotlight of it as if it it's all negative, but it isn't, right? It still creates awareness. I think we have more allies than we had before 2020. Even though there were people who were doing it to check a box, there are some people that were caught in the net that are passionate about these movements. So even though nothing has been done or said, it does start the conversation. And to Brian's point, when you hear this, like, go out there and ask the questions. What happened to this committee? What are we doing? Do you need help? Because sometimes also some of these volunteer committees, there's just nobody to do the work. So it's up to us to actually take it on, and if we are passionate about it, we need to say something and do something.
Awesome. I love that. And it is so true that I think awareness of this topic and the level of allyship, and even within their own Black actuary community, that there's a lot of different members and a lot of more influential positions. And so it'll be really exciting to see how that can turn and snowball into action as we kind of explore. So I know we talked about the NAIC, that charter coalition, and what may or may not have come out of that. But in general, there's been a lot of rollbacks of DEI programs at major companies. The EEOC is walking back disparate impact enforcement. And so, how has this looked in the CAS and SOA? Have they been facing pressure to scale back equity work? And is it now less safe to talk about systemic racism in the industry than it was 5 years ago?
Go ahead, Cole, you go first.
I'll go. The short answer is yes. I think the current administration has made it very difficult for anyone who doesn't agree with their agenda and who expects to receive any sort of government benefits, right? Like this goes from like federal funding to tax benefits. If you are an organization that relies on the government at all, like to you cannot pretend that it's safe for you to talk about racism the same way we were talking about it in 2020. While it's less safe, as I said before, the work that we did in 2020 doesn't the pendulum hasn't gone all the way back to maybe where we were in 2019. The work that we did in 2020 is still there, it still exists. It's just not as loud or it's not in the spotlight as it used to be.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like a lot of companies out there, the CAS, um, decided to scale back on some of the verbiage. So, there was a vilification of the DE and I. And after that vilification, the companies and the organizations that were still interested in the mission and following through and making sure things change, they said, okay, we have to be a little more aware of what we put out there, what we say, how we do it. But then the work still happens. So there's still, the CAS is still sponsoring a lot of research around bias and disparate impact and rating methodologies. And also, it's still a conversation that happens within the committees. It's a conversation that happens within the planning. So the effort is still there, and that goes for a lot of companies. Some companies scale back on what they say and how they say it, but they're still interested in the mission. Then again, there were companies that they weren't really interested anyway. And when they
Mm.
had the opportunity, because of the current administration, they said, "Yep, this is my chance to just wash my hands." It's because of the new government. So you have a combination of both.
I think those are definitely valuable perspectives and really interesting reviews on what's happening and maybe a great chance for IABA to, if we do know of some organizations that support or don't support some of these initiatives, is there a space for the IABA to kind of play a role to to highlight those types of items and just things to think about in the background for what role IABA can play and the members can play moving into the future. And one of the things that you guys did talk about is all of this research that has been done. And I know I see Malika on here, and there's just some really great folks that have been putting out research that have been talking about these topics. And as someone who was previously on the life and health side, I guess one of the things that I've been following is the tension emerging, and that has already been, I guess, encountered on the innovation and equity. And so AI and algorithmic underwriting promise efficiency and precision, but multiple institutes, and including the Brookings Institution AI Equity Lab, has raised serious concerns that when these models are trained on historical data, they don't just reflect past patterns, they replicate and amplify them. And for communities that were systematically excluded from life insurance, they're charged more for health coverage or steered towards inferior products. And this is just one example, I think, of innovation and where it intersects with equity. But what does responsible AI-driven underwriting look like, and how does this show up in your work and how you think about these items? And does the profession have the frameworks, the will, and frankly, the diversity of perspectives at the table to get it right?
So every conversation, every webinar I've participated in, a lot of the stuff, not every, but a lot of stuff I read about AI, they all they all mention, hey, we have to be very aware that any AI model we produce, any framework we produce, will not be affected by the current bias conversations happening online. Remember, AI is being trained by reading stuff that is, written by the public, listening to conversations, and so for the most part, they're learning from what's been said before. They're learning the biases that are already incorporated, the systematic biases that are already incorporated. So every conversation says, "Hey, how are we going to make sure that doesn't happen?" There were 2 or 3 CAS seminars when we were talking about that, and they say we just have to be diligent. We just have to make sure we're looking to see it. It doesn't happen when we see it happens, and we see it happen a lot with AI. Even some of the examples you just said to make corrections and just accept, hey, listen, we're training AI under a bias, a systematically biased, environment. So it will tend to pick up those habits.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also, I think two things. The first is that AI is going to be biased if we're using historical data. And I don't think that as insurance companies, we should be going in and saying that it's enough to keep an eye on it, right? We're in the beginning of, like, really, if you think about it, AI didn't start being used as widespreadly as it is since 2023. In the scheme of things, like the history of insurance, it's been 3 years of actually using AI. We're at the beginning, so we don't necessarily need to just put AI on top of our same processes, right? We're so used to using historical data. Maybe this is a time where we stop using historical data. We start looking at other data to use. Data now is so much, there's so much available data you can use and you can track, right? All this marketing data that we have. Maybe you're not training your models on claims data necessarily, because that could be, there's bias in it, because just the human intervention through claims historical data already had so much bias. So maybe we put historical data all the way to the side and just start using the now readily available more data, like marketing data that doesn't necessarily have bias and that is known to train using the AI information that we have now. The other thing, I'm a proponent of automating things, and AI could really be good for getting rid of bias. The reason I say that is I think that once you start having human intervention, like having underwriters come to your home, for instance, that's when you start introducing even more bias to the data. So I am while I'm cautiously optimistic that AI will lead us to a brighter future, but we need to change the way we think of it. We can't be lazy as actuaries in the room. Whenever you see someone using AI and they say keep an eye on it, don't keep an eye on it. Say, can we look somewhere else?
I absolutely love that. And I see, Brian, like what you're saying with we need to be aware, et cetera. And I think this leads a great opening. Like there's no shortage of public research, of conversations that have happened in this industry, documenting racial disparities in insurance pricing, underwriting, and access. But to me, what's missing is an organized actuarial voice translating that research into formal opinions, policy recommendations, and calls to action. IABA has the expertise. What role do you think IABA can and should play to leverage this expertise and platform moving forward?
I'll go and speak for IBA. Now I
Okay,
speak for all of you guys.
President.
So one of the things in our strategic plans this year has been to ramp up our thought leadership platform. I think we have an opportunity here to not only have our community itself speak on items that they are passionate about, but also we could be the voice around the topic for race and insurance, right? There's no one else that knows this as much as we do. We're at a great intersection in that we have dealt with the systematic racism that is already inbuilt in the system, and we are in insurance and we understand insurance. So I ask you guys just to be aware and try to be passionate if you can about this topic. And if you see something, say something. I am sounding like I'm at the airport here.
So,
Brian.
so a couple of things I see IAB to see that we do, and a couple of things I think we should do. So one, I'd love to see IAB provide more forums for discussions around information dissemination, right? As an example, what studies have been done out there? What studies, and I can speak to the CAS, have we put out there, and what are we saying about it with respect to even CPE requirements? We're required to have a certain amount of credits on topics around bias. I'd also like to see the leadership programs, which we're starting, and I hear they're going great. But I'd like to make sure we're giving the leaders that we're training tools and education to speak to these issues within their company, right? So say, hey, listen, once you get to that level where you have a voice and you can speak and you can lead thought, here's some things to think about. Here's the latest research. Keep that in mind. Um, I'd like to see the IBA form some subcommittees of their members who are actually in the room with respect to setting policy, right? Because Actuaries in general don't set policy unless you work for the Department of Insurance. Politicians set policy. However, there are actuaries in the room when these politicians are setting policy. I'd love to see a subcommittee where the IB gets all those folks together and say, hey, what's going on? What can we do to help? How can we do this? Um, then we could just get the like-minded people to talk about it and come to some conclusions.
I really like that, Brian. And I think maybe I need to sit down with you and write down some of your ideas.
I love that. I think they both sound exciting and really coherent in terms of IABA stepping up its thought leadership, having a place in a forum to kind of host those conversations, to host the body of work, to highlight some of these studies, et cetera, that have been done. And while we have everyone on the call and for you two, are there any studies or work that people are doing or that I guess individuals that you're aware of that are addressing this and changing okay, this is a research study, but really turning that into action of what can be implemented and some actuarial opinions. Anyone that you're familiar with or anything you guys want to highlight or suggest for the group to read or get familiar with?
Oh, go ahead, Gloria.
My go-to is Malika. Malika Benda
Yeah,
does
exactly.
great work.
Yeah, exactly. Malika's been involved in many studies. She's led many studies on this. In addition, Roselle Mosley at Pinnacle has also been involved in studies. Quite frankly, every care meeting I go to, there are sessions around bias and how to combat bias and how to look at bias. So I think if people are interested, there are forums out there. There's education available. There's papers out there. One thing we talked about this last week is maybe the IABA can have part of their website saying, oh, by the way, hey, here's a website of all the studies and kind of a summary of what they are, so people have ready access to them.
Love that. Um, one of the interesting things I guess that I don't think has been quite touched on, but I haven't been at the CAS or the SOA annual meetings for quite some time. But one of the things for the actuarial codes of conduct that I think are interesting is that actuaries don't just have a responsibility to the companies, but to the public. And so not just their clients, but the public at large. And with all of the data that does exist in the industry, the question isn't like, what happens or what can happen or what exists from a systemic racism. But what responsibility do you think actuaries generally have to act on what we already know without waiting for a regulator to force the issue? Like within the CAS and the SOA, are we taking that view of our public responsibility seriously when it comes to this topic? Or is there room for improvement and growth that shouldn't just happen within the IABA?
So I'll answer the first question first. What role should we have? So our role is to make sure we're doing the work with respect to the research. We're identifying, rating methodologies and usages of data that lead to disparate impacts. Um, that's the first thing. Once we've done that work, is to make sure that work, that knowledge is disseminated amongst our societies. So again, in the CAS case, to make sure the papers are published, you know, bad news is not pushed down, but actually elevated to say, hey, here's a study, here's something to think about. And then it's part of the education process. It's not good enough just to do the work and elevate it. Now you have to say, oh, yeah, you actually really have to read the papers. You have to understand. So I think they're doing a decent job with that. I think what is the next step? What more could they do? Um, and I think this is really the American Academy. They serve as kind of the lobbying arm of actuarial. I'd love to see the Academy do more in pressing the NAIC and the various insurance commissioners to say, hey, here's some things going on. What are you doing about it and questioning it? Some of that happens, but I would love to see that kick up a little bit.
Awesome. Anything to add to that, Gloria?
Yeah, completely agree with Brian. I also think that in general, I think as actuaries, there needs to be a bit of a cultural fix in the profession where we consider ourselves as insurance professionals and insurance leaders. there's a lot of us that just assume that we are coming in to crunch the numbers, but we are more than that. Like we should be willing to expand and look at bigger issues just outside of like loss development factors. So I think in general, like if you can think of the bigger picture rather than just the numbers that you're doing, you'll be able to make some of those changes. And I think that's a bit of what's missing in the actuarial profession.
I want to add one more thing too. So when we speak about what more actuaries could be doing, I'm going to make a general comment. In the end, politicians, state government, state insurance commissioners, they're the ones who are making the rules on what we can or cannot do. In states where they say, hey, listen, there's a disparate impact using credit scores, they said you can't use credit scores, and that was that. And that's because there were politicians elected by the people who understood what the issues were and were willing to make the changes to make things right. So what more could we do as actuaries? Quite frankly, we should be voting more. And if any of you on this phone hasn't voted every chance you got in every election since you were 18 years old, hang your head in shame, because that's where we make a difference. In states like California, they voted for folks who were going to take up the charge and do the right thing. So more than anything else, I say the call to actuaries is make sure you're voting.
And it is an interesting. I previously worked at a car insurer, and so they wrote insurance for almost all 50 states. And it's interesting where in the states that we couldn't use credit, we didn't use credit. In the states where we could, we did. And one of the things that I think is very present across the board is that translation of, well, why can't you use credit? And the regulator said, et cetera. But the reason and the context behind it, we should all feel uncomfortable with the use where it's allowed. And I think that those are the types of conversations and at that point, I wasn't at a senior position in that company, but I think everyone kind of knew my vocal stance on where that stood, and what I was hoping to change within that organization. But I do think that context behind where a regulator telling us A, B, and C, and us applying it only to the states that applies. I think now that we have more people in these senior positions, it's voting, but knowing that we're applying the rules where we're forced to, how can we shift that to our actuarial responsibility to be fair, regardless of the regulator's perspective?
Yep, yep, yep. It's looking at the methodologies, which by far rely on proxies, right? They're not actually causation variable. They're proxies for variables maybe we can't get easily or we can't measure. Credit risk is a great proxy for a bunch of variables that measure risk. And so as actuaries, we have to be diligent in saying, hey, listen, let me look a little deeper. Let me dig. It's easy to. I'll give you an example. In life insurance, they should be able to use race as a rating variable. And obviously, black people were charged more for policies. They were given less limit for race. And they said, oh, this is an easy proxy to use. But once, folks started digging into it, said, yeah, it's not actually race. There's other factors. It's economic factors. It's educational factors. That's what actuaries do. We dig deeper. We ask questions. Why does this work? Is this just correlated because it's a proxy or is it a real variable?
I absolutely love that example. And I guess a push that I really want to inspire or a perspective is to say, hey, as actuaries, we're really great at segmenting risk. When should we say, you know what, we should subsidize across versus actually use that as segmentation? And I think a great example there is pre-existing health conditions on the health side. Do we know some things? Yes. Might it lead to higher A, B, or C? Yes. But should we be able to segment and price on that when we have a duty for the role that insurance can and should play within the wider society? And I think taking that perspective and is your credit a pre-existing condition? Is your zip code a pre-existing condition? What other perspectives can we take that lens and apply them to end up in a more equitable modern day approach that reflects history and doesn't penalize for it continuously?
One
Okay,
more,
Gloria.
one more plug. I know Brian mentioned this, the American Academy being the kind of like a policy making organization. If you don't volunteer with them yet, try to volunteer with them. It's really, you get closer to making a change when you're part of these organizations.
Awesome. So to transition, but really build on that a little bit and making this concrete, I guess. So you're Black actuaries, and let's say other folks on the call, you're a Black underwriter, a Black claims leader, or an ally within the space. You're in a meeting where a model is approved or where a decision is being made that you know produces racially disparate outcomes. What do you actually do in that moment? Not what should happen in theory, but what do you do? And if you have done that in the past, what did you do? What has it cost you when you've done it? And then what would it look like for IABA to have your back if you do see something and say something?
I'll go
Should I go first?
first.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I haven't this is not the type of work that I do, but I unfortunately have to speak theoretically. What I would assume that you should do, I know you probably don't do this in practice, but if you see an issue that something that you may see that would be a sensitive issue, it's better to bring it up before the meeting, right? You don't want to bring it up and you find yourself fighting for in a meeting when you shouldn't. I don't think that's going to be as you may not get the answers that you expect when people are on the defense. So to the extent that you see something and it will cause a disparity, maybe call someone to the side and say, hey, I think this doesn't seem like it's going to be a good result. Like we should go this way instead, and just start prepping them before you get on a call, and then get on the call and present it. However, I have not done that, so I'll give it over to Brian.
Yeah. So it's interesting. So first, everybody should feel comfortable, and whatever way makes you comfortable. Gloria just gave an example of how you can do it, but you do need to point out if you do see disparate impact, you can prove it using the data, using the methodologies. So you point it out. If you're in a position to just say no, maybe the best thing to do is say, you know what, we're not going to do this. We need to find another way. Like you just said, Tomantha, and the folk when you can't use credit score in California, folks figured out a way around it. I remember Prop 103 came out many years ago, and everyone, ripped their clothes and gnashed their teeth. Oh my gosh, it'll never work. It'll never work. Guess what? The industry figured it out. So if you're in a position where you can say no and say, let's figure out how to do that. Yeah, will there be some ramifications? Maybe. Depends on how high up you are. Um, Understand you might be overruled. Maybe you're head of actuarial pricing for, ABC insurance company, but there's always a CEO, there's always a board that may overrule you. Our job, I mean, we have to, like I said before, we have to identify real causation variables and differentiate them from correlated proxies, especially ones that lead to disparate impact. And what are the risks? The risks are, obviously you may be perceived as biased for specific causes. But you can offset that by sticking to the data, sticking to the methodologies, being as objective as possible, and doing what they train us to do as actuaries.
I love that. And is there anything you want to add to what would it look like for IABA to have the back of people that are bringing these up, that are challenging these items? I know before you mentioned that IABA can host thought leadership, that we could feature some articles. Is there anything that you'd expand to that to push change as folks are really challenging the status quo?
Yeah, make sure these ideas are being further disseminated, amongst our membership and even outside of our membership. Make sure as we put together leadership programs that we're, saying, hey, here are the things we need our leaders to think about. Here are the topics they need to understand. Here are some ideas on how they can actually go back and talk about these topics and make some positive change. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, I really like the idea of providing the correct language to have these discussions.
Ooh, I absolutely love that. You made me think of, I'm a Tableau gal, I have to say. But one of the things I think that Tableau does very well, and I think IABA in the past as well, is to say, hey, here's how you should pitch coming to this conference for the company in order to get sponsorship. And so I think on some of these, having that opinion for here's how to address, how to talk, here's what study to reference, here's language of IABA that we have and host on our website for these opinions. But to equip people with the proper language and knowledge in order to challenge some of these pieces. And that way, it's not just Tomantha's perspective when I bring this up. It's like, oh, well, IABA as an organization feels this way. Our board, our members, our president, et cetera. So really excited to see what comes of that. I guess as you all think about that and what that will look like. Awesome. So I guess I have one final question for the panel before opening it up. But you both have played a game with rules set against you through a few different lenses. You've stayed in it, you've built careers, and you've earned real power to change things. That's the story. But we're still here in 2026 having versions of the same conversation. So this is the close, not a reflection, but a charge. What is the one specific thing that you are committing to do? And what is the one thing you're asking every person is in this audience to do before we meet again?
Okay. I can commit to have to bring this forward to IABA and continue to have this as a as a topic going forward, right? As we introduce our thought leadership, as we go into our leadership development program, just think about how race and insurance in general will affect our profession, not just on the DEI side, but obviously on like providing like inequality in underwriting or even availability of protection for minority groups. So just consistently thinking about that, and I can commit, and hopefully Jeff keeps me honest here, that we will include this in our thought leadership as a topic. And what I ask from the audience is that if you can help us, if you have any ideas, any papers that can help us build our library, like we'll really, really appreciate that.
Love that.
So, I guess one thing we have to realize is this kind of conversation is going to continue for the foreseeable future, right? I think this is a case where the point of the journey is not to arrive. For a lot of us, it's going to be the journey. Um, so we have to be committed to keep educating folks, mentoring people, and when you get to that position, sponsoring. And that's something again, as we train our leaders within IABA, we have to make sure we're instilling that confidence to say, yeah, I'm going to mentor people and sponsor people. Each one help one. That's what my dad used to always say. Each one help one. Um, the call to the audience: continue to educate yourself on these issues. Go online and do research. It's very easy to find the research that's been done. It's very easy to bring up the papers, download the PDF, and read about it. I would say get involved in the CAS and the SOA committees. Make sure you volunteer. Make sure our voice is heard on these committees when the decisions are being made. When we're trying to decide, hey, what are we going to require for education for our organizations? Get on those committees. Um, and again, I'm going to say this, you know, beat a dead horse here. Vote, please vote. It really does make a difference. A lot of people say, "Oh, I still hear this. My vote doesn't matter." Let me give you a little story. Recently, we had an election. I'm in Philadelphia. We had an election in Philadelphia, and there was no one running for judge of elections for my little district. So I said to my wife, "Hey, we're filling out our ballots, mail-in ballots." I said, "Hey, write my name in. I'm going to write my name in." Guess what? I got elected 2 votes. So every vote actually really does matter. So I would say do your research. You want to vote for the politicians who are going to support the things we think are true. We're going to support removing, disparate impact from rating methodologies and things like that.
I absolutely love those personal commitments and the calls to action for the audience. To expand upon that, one interesting observation now from the outside of the industry, but I think that the SOA and CAS can be very separate and very different to navigate. And for people that are just getting involved in their volunteerism or just getting involved or feeling comfortable with where they are professionally, to have a louder voice of participation. Is there a way that IABA can bring transparency to what committees exist and to highlight the members and the industry involvement that is happening? And especially to encourage, I guess, cross conversations where, oh, you're on this committee of the CAS, this same committee on the SOA is happening over here, and these people should connect. Is there any role that IABA can play in that you see, or what are your thoughts there?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think that's definitely a place that's missing. We do a good job with that with the JCED or the diversity committee. We do a good job there, but I think we can do a better job in highlighting the other committees. And I also don't want us to forget about the American Academy. I think all three should people should volunteer across all three.
Yep. Yeah, nothing to
Love
add. I
that.
agree.
Awesome. I think that takes us out of our formal questions for the panel. I know we have a few audience members here. We don't have necessarily structured a Q&A or audience participation, but does anyone kind of want to speak up, come off mute, ask the panelists questions, discuss anything as a group? How'd the session go? Things you'd like to see next from the IABA, or it's really an open time to take advantage of Brian and Gloria here, and also this, I guess, time to maybe shape what you want from the organization on as it relates to this topic as well.
Yeah, their hand up.
Go ahead, Malika.
Okay. I just was going to share some of the resources. I'll throw some links in the chat to the resources that Gloria and Brian mentioned, but the CAS has a research paper series on bias in insurance. We actually just published a new paper, I think today or a couple of days ago, but there are about 10 or 11 papers out there. The SOA also has a lot of research on bias and fairness on their DEI research page. And to Gloria's point, the academy is really where a lot of the public policy conversations are happening. And I know there are two ongoing committees in the academy, one for property and casualty, equity and fairness, and another is health equity. I'm not sure if there are life and retirement versions of that. But that's also a place where the different practice areas are speaking to each other pretty commonly because when regulations are happening, often they're kind of being talked about across all practice areas or like, in succession. So they do collaborate quite a bit, and that's a great place for people to get involved if they're interested. Now, I can throw some links in the chat for people to check out.
Thank you, Malika. And I do think that is a great call to action that seems like a hosted place for these resources. I know Gloria and Brian, you guys kind of suggested this, and I know Jeff is the executive director. But that will be a nice, I guess, thing that might be coming down the pipeline to have a singular place, a reference place that IABA is curating, looking for, and featuring this type of work. And then Gloria, I guess, to your point of the developing the language around how to bring it up. But it seems like that will be something to look forward to. While we have you, Malika, I guess as someone that's deep in this work and aware of this body of evidence and the continuous studies that have kind of come out, can you speak to some impacts that you've seen for the industry actually acting on some of this information and things that have changed or that you have seen from your experience?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. One is broadly, I think that having these conversations about what is or isn't perceived to be fair and where we might want to look with regards to fairness is a lot safer than it was before. Maybe something that you wouldn't really be able to bring up in your workplace. But now that we've had all of this ongoing conversation and debate and research, there's more, I think, of a foundation, and people kind of know that it's being talked about in our conferences and stuff, so that they can bring it back to work. And then from a regulation point of view, there are definitely states that have developed either market conduct studies or are working on fleshing out regulation to actually require companies to test for bias and fairness to prove that their rates do not cause a disparate impact, or if they do, that they have like a very strong case for that. Colorado is one. DC has done a market conduct study. And the NAIC, they have an AI model law that many states have adopted, which does have some piece around bias and fairness and making sure that the governance that you use is addressing that as well. So there are things happening across in the US, across the board, and in other countries as well. That I think, in some places where maybe there's not something going on, they're watching to see how that comes about. And then, as those things get fleshed out and finalized, we might see more.
Awesome. Great to hear that. Anyone else from the audience? Any additional notes from the panel members? Any calls to action that resonated with folks? Anything coming down the pipeline for IABA that really felt meaningful or supportive or impactful? All right, if we have a pretty shy group, then no problem. I guess I really want to thank Brian and Gloria for participating in this conversation, for having me as a moderator, and thank you, IABA, for hosting this conversation and continuing to push on this topic. And Brian and Gloria, any closing thoughts from your side?
No, I just want to thank, obviously, you, Tomantha, for coming back and moderating this session. And I also want to thank Malika, who was instrumental in making this happen too. And Brian, of course, for being a fellow panelist with me.
Yes, thank you to all of you. I enjoy participating in this. I guess a couple final thoughts. Be the agent of change. For the most part, folks aren't going to do it for us. We're going to have to either incent people to do it or do it ourselves. So don't sit around and wait for it to happen. Be a part of it. We've given you many examples to be involved and to help facilitate change. Then it will happen. Change starts from grassroots effort for the most part.
Awesome. I love that. So I'll be super excited to follow along and see what comes and see, to your point, how I can also myself contribute to that, as this is still a passion of mine. So I really thank you all. Have a great day. Jeff, any closing comments?
Hey, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for attending our next conversation. And not necessarily in this series, but our next conversation overall is actually going to be on March 23rd. So later on this week, we'll have another coffee conversation. So we encourage you to register and participate in that as well. Again, this is a big part of our push for this year as an organization, is to add more member value. So to create more content for you guys to engage with and participate in on March 26th. So thank you guys so much for your support. Tomantha, always appreciate having you back with us. Brian, thank you for being a good friend of the organization. And Gloria, obviously, thank you for your leadership. To everyone joining us today, again, we appreciate you for being with us, and we look forward to having you as part of our next conversation. Have an amazing day. Talk to you guys soon.